In this module, we'll look at the history of national parks in the United States, from their envisioning to creation and management. We'll examine their portrayal as untouched wildernesses, despite evidence that Indians used and resided in the parklands, the impetus behind federal management of the parks, and the removal of Indians from parklands, as well as their installation as exhibits. We'll also explore some of the effects that tourism can have on indigenous cultures and communities. We left off in Module 4 with this quote from Thomas Bonnickson from America's Ancient Forests, From the Ice Age to the Age of Discovery. Native Americans were an integral part of America's forests. The forests, the people who lived there, formed an inseparable whole that developed together over millennia. Native Americans helped to create and sustain the ancient forests that Europeans found beautiful enough to set aside in national parks. We can see that Bonnickson's perspective is one of holism, with Native Americans as being one of the factors in the developmental and evolutionary histories of these landscapes and their species. We might also temper this with Kat Anderson's perspective that the effect of Native Americans of humans on the landscape probably varies. It's not uniform, but would probably vary from one location to the next. So now let's turn our focus a little bit and take a closer look at the history of national parks in the United States and their creation. So in Module 4, we discussed how the idea of wilderness is a cultural construct, not translatable to all cultures. Furthermore, in cultures with a concept of wilderness, the meaning changes from generation to generation. We can see that in the history of our national parks. As they were first envisioned by the artist George Catlin, who is credited with their conception, the intent was to create large tracts of Indian wilderness that would be protected from development by government policy, both the wild lands and the Indians that inhabited them. They were considered to be one and the same, part and parcel. At that time, Indians were perceived as one of the defining features of wilderness. As ideas of wilderness continued to evolve, the inclusion of indigenous peoples as an integral component of wilderness fell out of favor. Several political, economic, social, and scientific interests shaped the national park system, and allowing Indians to continue living in or harvest from parklands was at odds with a number of their goals. A shift in public and scientific sentiment now favored creating separate areas, some designated for wilderness protection and others for Indian habitation. The creation of national parks went hand in hand with the movement of Indians to reservations, and Caitlin's vision of a large expanse of protected land in all its pristine beauty and wilderness, where the world could see for ages to come the native Indian in his classic attire galloping his horse amid the fleeting herds of elk and buffaloes, was in fact very short-lived. For American Indians, these changing ideologies meant that they were removed, often forcibly, from lands they had once lived in or accessed for all or parts of the year. For tribes who had lived in or near national parks, the hunting, fishing, harvesting, and mining that had once been a part of their economies was lost. And for many tribes, treaty rights were discontinued, the rationale being that newly created state game laws trumped the prior treaty rights. Additionally, the plant and animal communities existing within the park boundaries would see change in management, as native management practices were replaced with federal management practices. The emergence of a dual island system of nature preserves and Indian reservations stemmed from a changing ideology about Western history and Indians' place in it, coupled with political and social interests and emerging ideas of manifest destiny, conservation, environmental concerns, and commercial and economic interests. As American territories expanded following the Mexican War and the British relinquishment of claims on the Oregon territories, more Americans migrated westward. The growing settler population in the plains resulted in increasing encounters with the Plains Indians, accompanied by competition for resources that often led to hostility and sometimes resulted in violence. The emergence of the ideology of manifest destiny, coupled with tension over resources, led to a paradigm shift in the Western perception of Indians' place in the environment and in the United States in general. The romantic stereotype of the noble savage living in harmony with nature, nostalgic relic of a simpler past, was replaced with a stereotype of the ignoble savage, an impediment to progress and an affront to American morals and values, whose primitive subsistence activities were either stumbling blocks to America's more productive use of the land or destructive of the wild landscapes Americans sought to preserve in national parks. It can be challenging to understand manifest destiny today. These quotes from the newspaperman Samuel Bowles speak to the sentiment that many felt at the time. We know they are not our equals, he argued, and we know that our right to the soil as a race capable of its superior improvement is above theirs. Therefore, let us act directly and openly our faith. Let us say to the Indian, he continued, you are our ward, our child, the victim of our destiny, ours to displace, ours to protect. We want your hunting grounds to dig gold from, to raise green on, and you must move on. Conservation and environmental concerns in the mid-1800s also called for the removal of Indians from the landscape, or at least from those portions of the landscape that Americans hoped to preserve with government protection. There was a re-envisioning of uninhabited nature as the aesthetic ideal, coupled with a concern that subsistence activities would disrupt park environments. George Perkins Marsh, considered by some to be the first conservationist, was concerned that the increasing resource extraction that was fueling the burgeoning economy would harm America's environment beyond repair. In light of this, Marsh advocated for the conservation of some pristine tracts of land, untouched by humans and managed ostensibly to serve as models of what nature should be, which would help in restoring disturbed harmonies and the material improvement of wasted and exhausted regions, he felt. Development of Niagara Falls by unregulated commercial interests was considered an eyesore that detracted from the natural beauty and grandeur of one of America's most treasured natural features. To ensure that the parks were protected as wildernesses, conservationists, environmentalists, and politicians called for a governing agency to assume management and stewardship of these tracts of land. Private industry would not be allowed in the parks and would be controlled and regulated surrounding the parks. Subsistence activities are also economic in nature, so banning them went hand in hand with the philosophy of placing the management of Yellowstone under government control and in the hands of professional natural resource managers who were absent of any private economic interests. Gone were the ideas of conserving parks with the Indians living inside them. In accordance with the changing attitudes towards Indians in political life, the trend continued in environmental thought. Indians, their subsistence activities, and their lack of moral fiber were now understood to be a drain on resources and a threat to the balance of nature. Yellowstone Park Superintendent Captain Moses A. Harris wrote in 1889, efforts to protect the remnant of the large game of this country and the growing timber in the national park and adjacent regions could not be implemented as long as the park afforded summer amusement and winter sustenance to a band of savage Indians. Although environmentalists and conservationists wanted to see the parks protected for their unspoiled natural beauty and considered commercial management to be at odds with these goals, the federally managed parks still needed to attract paying visitors both for direct income and to maintain public support for the appropriation of federal dollars towards park maintenance. If the taxpayer was paying something, they wanted to get something in return. The development of areas surrounding parks with amenities and infrastructure for visitors was therefore encouraged. Somewhat conflicting treatment of Indians and Indian histories ensued. Indians were forcibly removed from park lands by federal soldiers. Quote unquote problem Indians who tried to return to the parks following removal were considered poachers that park rangers controlled and removed by force as needed. These Indians were considered detrimental to the nature housed inside the park and to the enjoyment of such nature by European Americans who might be alarmed to encounter soldiers rounding up Indians for removal, sometimes with the aid of weapons. Indians were also removed from park histories, described as only occasional visitors, or in the case of Yellowstone, as having avoided the park for superstitious reasons, despite ample evidence to the contrary. It's hard to say if this was done purposefully and conscientiously. It seems likely in many cases that people saw what they wanted and expected to see, or explained what they saw according to their expectations. We describe culture as a lens through which we view the world. It's not so hard to understand how the view that Indians despoil the land would lead one to assume that recently abandoned dwellings must actually be quite ancient when finding them in an unspoiled and quote-unquote pristine landscape, particularly if one is a soldier, explorer, or tracker not versed in dating encampments. Seemingly at odds with the policy of removal is the inclusion of idealized Indians or noble savages, often portrayed as a remnant of a nostalgic bygone time, soon to disappear. These Indians were non-threatening, their activities and movements having been manipulated to fit within the park goals, and the people and cultures themselves portrayed as vanishing. Indians were allowed to remain only as historical fragments and museum exhibits portraying an idealized culture that could be controlled by park officials and which attracted tourists. Real and sovereign Indians with free agency, whose goals might not be aligned with the mainstream public's, were removed. Several national parks also preserve and promote Indian artifacts as focal points. One example is Mesa Verde National Park, established in 1906, the highlight of which are cliff dwellings dating to the 13th century. Spence writes on page 4, U.S. national parks, as models of protected wilderness, in the modern sense of untouched by humans, serve as models for preservation and dispossession of lands across the world. In fact, many of the scenarios that occurred as the United States began to establish national parks in the late 19th century continue to play out around the globe as nation-states strive to protect critical habitat and attract foreign currency in the form of tourist dollars. Conservation and globalization are intertwined. Globalization implies the world will adopt Western values and culture, most notably an emphasis on market economy, competition, and self-interest. Indigenous groups that possess a very different culture may find this process very painful. Often indigenous cultures emphasize group good over individual good. Very often, too, they are cash poor, entering the global economy without any cash and with a very different worldview usually means they are stuck at the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. Meanwhile, the emphasis on competition and self-interest can break the social safety network that provided some stability when they were engaged in a more traditional lifestyle. Many aid and development organizations promote tourism and conservation as mechanisms by which poor countries can increase their gross domestic product, or GDP, combat poverty, and improve their economies and their citizens' lifestyles. States also have a vested interest in seeing that every adult is engaged in wage labor as opposed to subsistence labor. This is another way to increase the GDP of the country. In the face of increasing industrialization and the accompanying loss of species and important and unique habitats worldwide, tourism and conservation are often promoted as a win-win solution. Countries can increase their GDP by attracting tourist dollars, they can employ their citizens in the tourism industry, and in doing so they can also conserve their natural resources and wonders all at once. Heavily influenced by Western conservationists, countries often remove the local population from the land once it's established as a conservation area. The protection and conservation of sensitive ecological areas is a concern among global scale cultures who also widely subscribe to the ideology that nature is separate from and necessarily harmed by humans, especially extractive economic activities, whether subsistence or commercial. Lands of conservation value are often those inhabited by people living a traditional lifestyle that is less extractive than lives dependent on commerce and currency. Many conservationists, environmentalists, and scientists believe protection of these lands first requires the relocation of the human inhabitants, often indigenous peoples, from their homelands, or in some cases, restriction of their access, mobility, and/or curtailment of resource use. These people tend to have smaller, more marginalized populations, making it harder for them to resist. Once the local population is removed, state or state-approved professional land managers are brought in to manage the resource. In order to pay for the management and protection efforts, tourism and protected area development often occur simultaneously. Park visitation has been considered a non-extractive use that doesn't damage ecological systems, as summarized in the adage, Leave nothing but footprints, take nothing but pictures. The economic benefits that result from tourism activities also help support the conserved land. There's also an economic return to private tourism companies. In developing countries, this can bring in foreign currency and taxes, both of which help to boost the economy. The subsistence activities that were displaced are not included in the budget of the nation state. They don't generate any taxes, so their loss usually goes unnoticed. Locals may either try to continue their former practices on more marginal lands, they may engage in the tourism or conservation industry, for which they often don't have the skills or social capital to secure the higher paying jobs. Or otherwise, they may try to mitigate the loss of their economic activities. This sometimes entails begging or seeking employment in nearby towns or communities, usually as unskilled workers. A few may find work in the tourism industry, putting on cultural displays of dancing, for example, that tourists pay to watch. Sometimes the cultural dances, songs, or dress are changed to appeal more to the tourists than to be authentic to the culture. The perception of tourism and recreation as harmless and compatible with conservation goals is just now starting to shift among land managers, ecologists, and the general public. In Colorado, for example, the biggest threat to wilderness is now considered recreation. This is in part due to the curtailment of the logging industry, particularly clear-cut logging, which creates an immediate and drastic change in landscape appearance and ecosystem function. Combined with the ever-increasing number of people who are engaging in recreation and visiting wilderness areas to camp, picnic, hike, backpack, mountain climb, birdwatch, ski, etc. In natural resource circles, the phrase "we're living our mountains to death" is now quite often heard. Often influenced by Western ideas of conservation, and in many cases influenced by Western environmental activists and conservationists, the removal of peoples from their homelands when their homelands occur in park systems has occurred throughout the world. When the Serengeti was declared a national park in Tanzania, for example, in 1951, Nelson wrote, "The original colonial law declaring Serengeti a national park did, however, contain a provision that the resident Maasai could continue to live there. But it was a promise that didn't hold for long. From the outset, conservation organizations in Europe and the United States weighed in to build an increasingly powerful lobby to expel the Maasai, arguing that the Serengeti soil was too fragile and its water too scarce to support both humans and wildlife." Ironically, though, the Serengeti would still be supporting humans, but they would be tourists instead of indigenous people who had always lived there. Although more and more newly formed conservation areas are starting to include the local population in their boundaries and management, until recently, indigenous people often lost territory with the formation of a new national park. With the loss of territory often came the loss of both traditional economic activities and the social safety network that provides stability when times are tough. This left people more vulnerable to crises at a time when they were also more likely to experience a crisis, when they're losing their lands, their traditional economic activities, and their social safety network. Stock associates are one such example of a traditional social safety network that is employed in many pastoral societies. So these are societies where herding animals is the primary economic activity. Stock animals are lent to friends and family in need, and also borrowed from friends and family when there is a need. There are usually rules and regulations, which are often unwritten, and which guide the borrowing and the lending of the animals. If a pastoralist were to lose his herd due to a drought year, the herder may call in his or her debts and borrow stock animals from those to whom he has lent before. There can be cultural norms associated with the loans. So, for example, in some communities, a person would call in a loan and then they would keep the lent animal only until 2 offspring are produced, then return it to its original owner, keeping the offspring. This provides them a way to get their herd going again. The intent with the stock associates is not to pay one's debt back as soon as possible, but rather to maintain a dense network of associates with whom one has lent and borrowed. The more debts a herder has not called in means the more potential offers of help he will have when he does experience need. In this way, giving is thought to benefit the giver more than the receiver, and strong social norms mandate that requests for aid be granted. This belief is obviously at odds with globalization and with its emphasis on competition and self-interest. And as an example of how alternative safety networks might not be as robust when incorporated in globalized societies, let's consider an example from Kenya. Between 1979 and 1981, Kenya experienced severe drought. Prior to this, pastoral communities in northern Kenya had been experiencing a breakdown of the indigenous institutions that helped pastoralists cope with drought, while in southern Kenya, these institutions remained intact. Many pastoralists from the north migrated to famine relief camps, established by aid organizations and by the government, while in the south, the southern pastoralists relied instead on the social safety network that allowed them to send family members to live with relatives and friends in areas that were not experiencing drought, and they also were able to send animals to forage reserves. The pastoralists in the north, who went to the famine relief camps, were required to be sedentary in order to receive aid, making it more difficult for them to participate in the social safety network with other pastoralists or to engage in herding activities. McCabe, in his study published in 2002, found that Turkana pastoralists who did not go to famine relief camps during the extended drought felt those that did had shunned the traditional system of reciprocal mutual aid and therefore did not make good trading partners. As a result, pastoralists who went to the camps did not receive livestock from wealthier herdsmen to help build up their herds, and it took them much longer to recover from the drought, compared to the pastoralists who did not receive aid but instead relied purely on the social safety network. With the creation of conservation-based tourism following the market system, some local people may be able to find jobs in the no-tourist sector, but generally not all will. In addition, the jobs available to the local population tend to be the lower-paying jobs. The uneven distribution of benefits from tourism often means that some individuals will benefit more than others from the influx of tourists and tourist dollars, leading to increased economic disparity. In societies that traditionally valued group good over individual good, this can lead to infighting, resentment, and a breakdown of the social safety network within the community. As the market economy gains a foothold over subsistence economic activities, poverty can increase. Finally, the government may be more concerned with the needs of the tourists who are bringing in foreign currency and bolstering the GDP than they are with the needs of a small, marginalized local population. We'll touch on this more in a moment. As the area develops for conservation, it may also develop for the local population. Vaccinations, improved access to medical treatment for infections and accidents, and wells that provide a steadier and cleaner source of water can lead to an increase in the local indigenous population. This larger population will be dependent on fewer resources. Generally, some resources are designated as off-limits to the local people when the conservation area is established, reserved instead for the wildlife and the tourists that the wildlife attracts. So now you've got a growing indigenous population, but a smaller resource base for them to utilize, and the problem with poverty is compounded. When tourism supplies an important influx of foreign currency into a country, the nation state becomes concerned with providing a stable economic climate for the tourism industry, and they may prioritize the needs of tourists over local populations, particularly if those local populations are marginalized. Many of you have probably heard of the tourism police in Thailand, a special branch of the police that deals specifically with tourists. This could be considered one such example. I experienced another in Yemen in the late 1990s. And Yemen at the time was far more stable then than it is now. Although there was some disparity within the Yemeni population and different ethnic groups occurring together. The Bedouin population was a marginalized population, and they felt that their needs were not being served by the government. In order to protest this and demand some action by the government on their behalf, they started kidnapping foreign tourists and visitors. The victims of these kidnappings were taken to the Bedouin encampments in the desert and treated to a dose of traditional hospitality. So this is one of those cultures in which hospitality and being very hospitable to strangers is very, very important. So you might have the fattest goat slaughtered for a special dinner to honor the visitor, who is a kidnapping victim as well. In exchange for the release of the kidnapping victim, the tribe would demand from the government schools, roads, and other infrastructure. So they say, we'll release our hostage if you provide some infrastructure for us. In response, the government developed a system of protecting tourists. So rather than respond to the Bedouin request, which they may not have been able to do financially or politically, they instead funneled money towards protecting tourists. So this was also money that was now not able to protect the Yemeni population or go to their needs, other than those who were benefiting from tourism. So foreign visitors who were planning to travel through an area where the kidnappings had become quite common were required to meet at a checkpoint at a specific time and to travel in a caravan led by an armed escort vehicle. And you can see a picture of the armed escort vehicle here. It's a Toyota with a rocket launcher on the back, but this was, and it still is, a fairly one of the poorer countries in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. So this actually does represent quite a large amount of resources that are being directed towards tourists who are not paying anything for this. The tourists were also assigned individual bodyguards. These were also supplied by the government, and you can see a picture of one standing here. And the bodyguard would be assigned to one tourist who they would follow around and ensure their safety throughout their stay as best they could. While these photos of the guards might seem modest, keep in mind that Yemen is a developing nation and one of the poorer Arab countries. It's currently experiencing famine. The expenditure of federal funding on tourists does benefit the portion of the local population that engages in tourism, so those folks who are driving taxis and hoteliers. But it does not help the marginalized populations, such as the Bedouin. As I mentioned, Thailand has a branch of police called the tourist police that are specifically put in place to help tourists. In addition to the paid tourist police, Thailand also now uses tourist police volunteers. Many other countries that rely on an influx of tourist dollars may spend more resources on policing areas that tourists are likely to visit at the expense of areas that are mostly inhabited by locals. For countries that are relying on foreign tourism for a significant portion of their GDP, there can be pressure to develop propaganda that presents the local people as happy and accommodating and happy to see those tourists. Political expression can be suppressed to give the illusion of a stable, safe, and pleasant place to visit. Nothing like riots to discourage tourism. Likewise, local issues, both internal strife and conflict with tourists in the tourism industry, may be hidden or masked. Covering up conflict with propaganda presented in tourist brochures and by the hotel and tourist industry staff is one way to create the appearance of an accommodating population that's happy to see the visitors. Some areas with conflict might be off limits to tourists, while others might be off limit to locals. For example, in many places, you might find beaches around luxury hotels in which the local population is forbidden from visiting or strongly discouraged. There can be special permits, so certain individuals can acquire a permit, for example, to sell goods, and perhaps they are groomed to present a controlled image or are known to abide by the standards expected. Carefully choreographed cultural shows are also often provided by luxury hotels, and these tend to focus on art forms, so it might be singing or dancing or recitation, rather than everyday life. And they're often modified to appeal to tourists, as opposed to be authentic to the local culture. We have seen in the past 20 years that increasingly in tourism, people travel with the goal of experiencing an exotic culture or an exotic landscape. These exotic cultures and landscape provide the supply side of ethnic tourism, but they often don't see many of the benefits that come from tourism, so the economic benefits. Marketing corporations in the tourism industry reap most of the financial rewards. They also manufacture culture and manipulate symbols to appeal to travelers and tourists. The coconut bra is one such example. The coconut bra is a creation of Western culture. It was designed to appeal to tourists. It is not authentic Polynesian or Hawaiian culture. The picture that you see here was taken at an airport in French Polynesia. So these are quote unquote traditional dancers who are greeting the passengers on the plane, but one can question how traditional are they if they're wearing the coconut bra, which is manufactured by Western culture. Tourism often depicts a sanitized and shallow version of the local culture. People come away with misinformation about local traditions and practices, and no information to interpret social ills that they might see, such as poverty, crime, prostitution, child labor, or begging. Because they have no understanding of why these social ills exist, they're often attributed to immorality on the part of the local population, which ties in with ideas about meritocracy. If one wanted to get ahead, one could if only one applied oneself. That these ills are often products of tourism, the world economy, global scale cultures, and nation states being responsive to the majority at the expense of the marginalized populations often goes unrecognized.